But specifically today, we're talking really about this documentary you made, Blurred Lines, and the thing that made you want to make it, and the feelings you had as you made it, and the reflections you've had about it. So over to you, Kirsty.
Good morning. It's so great to be at the Fifth Wow Conference. I see lots of daughters and mothers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles and everybody here, and I hope you're all indeed Newsnight viewers as well. Yeah, that's what I want to hear. But I'm here specifically starting to talk about blurred lines, and then we're going to have a panel discussion to talk about the implications of blurred lines in many different spheres of media and life for young women and indeed women at work. It was quite an extraordinary moment, Blurred Lines, because it started so many different conversations and debates. And for me, as a broadcaster, it was a seminal moment. Because it kind of, everything coalesced around the idea that all is not yet well. And for me, 40 years ago, the journey had started to bring women and men together to have some kind of gender balance. And here we were, 40 years later, suffering something that seemed to be a phenomenon. It wasn't that sexism and misogyny had disappeared. It wasn't that. Of course, it was still around. But there was something in the discourse, something had amplified it, something had changed it. There was a coarseness. Things were happening to young women that were extraordinary, were upsetting. Things that were acceptable in the social sphere, like rape jokes, and you couldn't imagine why. And actually, it was the controller of BBC Two, Janice Hadlow, who really pushed this. She said, look, I think there's something in the ether. There's something we need to explore. And I wanted explored in BBC Two. And that was very courageous, because there were lots of things that were going to come out in that film that were very controversial. And one of the most gratifying things for myself and Gabby Hornsby, the director and producer you'll meet soon, and Lily, who was in the film, was that the film was then called on by schools, to be taken up in schools as a tool for lots of young women and young men in schools to be able to talk about the things that they felt it was very difficult to talk about. So from that point of view, we'd made huge amounts of progress as women in the last 40 years, in the personal sphere, in the political sphere, in the professional sphere, and indeed in the cultural sphere. But something was going wrong. There was more laddish behaviour. We had obviously problems on the internet with trolling. It seemed to be acceptable for people to bully girls in the playground. It seemed to be acceptable for what were originally quite mild-mannered lads' magazines to become much more extreme, to have things like breast counts in them. There was a lot of strange things happening online, and we wondered whether the online world was something that we could explore. Things were being passed around online, incidents at universities, or, there's a famous Stirling bus incident, which we covered. There was something going on. So anyway, the producer and director, Gabby Hornsby, was then set off on a task to find a kind of, not just examples, but was there a thesis? Now, she went out with an open mind, and it wasn't as if there were just a few incidents. It was easy to find things. It was easy to find things that were problematic. And so what we did was we looked at these. We then explored them with linguists and psychologists as to what was driving this behaviour. And some of the problems were that the internet itself, which is an incredible force for good, in terms of cultural exchange, knowledge, empowerment of women and men, democratic, was also insidious, potentially dangerous, and threatening, both to men or women. Then we looked at what was the basis of the internet, and that actually grew out of geek culture. We wondered if there was something in geek culture that was essentially quite buccaneering, quite male, that kind of language dominated. So what we did was we looked at the places also where women had made progress, and wondered if that in itself had triggered a backlash. And then when we looked at things like the feeds coming in from Question Time, it's well documented now when people like Mary Beard was on, she was getting so much abuse, and we wondered what was driving that. Was there insecurity? Was it tribalism, whereas you might get the odd hate mail letter, you were then getting tribes working together on the internet, amplifying, egging each other on. So we came back to geek culture, and we wondered if there was something in the gaming culture. So what we did as part of our filming is we went to a tremendous gaming convention, which was a kind of hangar in the middle of England, where thousands of people had bought their computers. And the online gaming world, which is quite a male space, we looked at what was happening there. Now, in Scotland, there are these incredibly talented people called Rockstar. And Rockstar are gamers. Rockstar devises games. And Rockstar devised the biggest selling computer game in the world, Grand Theft Auto 5. I mean, obviously we approached Rockstar as far as Grand Theft Auto 5 was for an interview, and they declined. And now when I go about and people say, you know, how on earth is that part of Grand Theft Auto 5? I say, write to Rockstar, ask them. Because the point is that these games are supposedly only for 18 and above. But are you telling me that kids, I know kids that play Grand Theft Auto 5, and I know parents that had no idea what was in Grand Theft Auto 5. So that is part of the general, you know, atmosphere of children's and young people's lives just now. And they see that. They see online porn. They see people being trolled. And what do they think? Well, we're going to hear in a minute from a young woman, Lily, who was part of our film, who's now, she's not dogging off school this morning, as we call it in Scotland. She's got her A-levels just now, and she's going to go into school. But we want to talk this morning about how we make that better. How we make that better and how we stop that atmosphere pervading particularly young women's lives. Because it's not just the powerful, like Mary Beard, who suffer it. It's the powerless, like young schoolgirls who are making their way in the world, who have to face it from boys who don't actually understand how dangerous they're being with the attitudes that they have towards their classmates.
Very good. And I think, you know, if you get a chance to look at the whole of Blurred Lines, it's so educative because it looks at comedians and rape jokes. It looks at the whole idea of magazines and the sort of permissiveness that is given under the idea that, well, you know, it's all a bit of a joke, we're all in it together, have a sense of humour, when actually the women are really almost coerced into feeling that they ought to accept this kind of popularity.
Which is why what Laura Bates says, everyday sexism, is so brilliant, because what happens is that in the opposite direction is a reinforcer. Because the more people share their stories on that, there is a sense of empowerment there that it's unacceptable. And the more people who find it unacceptable, the more chance there is that people can be stopped.
So we're now going to invite 4 people onto the stage. If you don't want to come along, folks, here you come. We've got, who's coming up first? We've got Gabby Hornsby, who was the producer and filmmaker. Thank you. Is Hannah Pool there? Hannah Pool, you've already met. Journalist, writer, columnist. Lillian Evans, are you there, Lily? Yeah, Lily, thank you. Who also runs an online campaign. And then Ian Katz, who's the editor of Newsnight. He worked at The Guardian from 1990 to 2013. Thanks, Ian. Thanks. I think it's probably appropriate to start with you, Lily, because, I mean, not that you represent all girls, we're not asking you to do that, but you obviously have the experience of being a young woman. How old are you?
I'm 17.
17.
17.
Okay, so you've got the experience of being a young woman and growing up in a space that has given this almost what seems like new permission, both domestically, i.e. in the playground, in the school, etc., in your social life, and also online and on any broadcasting space, to talk about girls in a particular way. And I'm wondering whether that's affected you and how you view it.
Well, of course, for girls, it kind of seems like such a universal experience for girls that it's quite hard to say how much it affects you, because you can't really compare it to other people around you, because no girl has kind of experienced a childhood without a sexist society. But of course you can see it. So in STEM subjects like science, technology, blah, 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 they use this term, the leaky pipeline, to say we start off with lots of girls, and then as we get higher up in management jobs on Newsnight, for example, we kind of lose girls along the way because they don't have confidence in themselves. Maybe they're getting really a lot of online abuse, or even abuse in real life for what little they have done already.
So their achievements are being undermined.
Yeah.
before they've almost even
Before
had the
they go
confidence.
further.
Can I just say, all power to Lily and the other young women who took part, because it was very brave of them, because they didn't know if they were going to suffer for it. Did you? I mean, you know.
Thanks, Kirsty.
Was it hard?
It was a bit scary to take part, but luckily me and my other two friends who I was on with, Georgia and Yaz, didn't get a lot of bad messages. I think I might have blocked one or two people, but in general, it was fine. Unfortunately, I know a few other people in the documentary did get a lot of awful messages, and it must have been so scary for them. I didn't get any bad messages from the documentary, but I have in the past, and I know it's absolutely awful.
But, you know, how do you feel about the fact that on one level, the presentation to all of us is that we live in a much better world, a much more equal world, that UK society is kind of almost there with regard to gender equality. And the reason for founding WOW is because I just thought, oh, come on, give me a break. That is just not the case.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you feel this creates a sort of puzzlement in girls, that they're being told that they are emancipated and gender equal, and that that's not their experience?
That is a really kind of weird experience, like as a feminist or as any young girl who thinks sexism is bad, because although we have come a long way from, let's say, 100 years ago when women could vote and women couldn't work and their possessions were taken from them and given to whatever man owned them when they got married with their father. So we have come a long way, but there is a huge way to go, and it's quite difficult to see that end goal because it doesn't exist anywhere yet. So it can sometimes be a bit deceiving to compare it to the past rather than to the future, because we have come a long way, but there is a long way to go.
Gabby, you set about to make the programme with Kirsty, and I'm wondering whether you were already aware of the kind of wholesale misogyny and sexism that you found when you got out there, or whether it was a shock to you.
Well, the programme was quite a long genesis, and the sort of initial starting point had actually been 50 years after the publication of Feminine Mystique, where are gender relations now? And I think what was interesting when I started doing the research, and what really struck Janice Hadlow when we were discussing the subject, and the thing that was sort of felt freshest and, you know, most exciting in terms of telly, but the most distressing in terms of being a woman, was this undercurrent of really quite vicious dialogue and discourse that was directed at women, which I found quite shocking. And what I found particularly shocking was, you know, we were accused, on Twitter by some people of cherry-picking incidents in the film, but actually the volume of research was a mountain, and what ended up in the film was tiny in comparison to the number of incidents we found, the number of examples, and I mean, we could have made 4 hours full of the same sort of material. There was just this wealth of evidence out there that for women today think all is not well in the garden. I think there is something going on, and what I found particularly striking making it was listening to young women like Lily and the students we spoke to at university, was how different their experience was now compared to my own experience. So I was at university in the mid-90s, and I think that what young women face today is a much tougher environment than I did, and that was what I found really distressing making the film, and really shocking, was that it felt that there had been, you know, we had imagined Kirsty when, you know, she was at university before me, and certainly when I was at university, that we were on some sort of smooth path towards a better world and equality, and everything was just going in one direction. And I think what we found making the film was that progress was met with resistance, and that, you know, there was a series of backlashes, and what we're experiencing now is a particularly unpleasant backlash.
Okay, I think this is a key thing, isn't it? Because we've got kind of several generations of women sitting here, and the hatred that is fueling some of this this work, I'd agree with Kirsty that it's not something that I experienced in that way. I mean, I find myself now in tears occasionally and baffled by hatred, by why I am hated, just, you know, as a woman. And that's what you are saying, that you found that out there in a way that you don't believe was there even when you were around as a young woman.
Certainly as a young woman at university, I was not expecting to, I would say I experienced some mild sexism from some of my tutors, maybe. but what I was not expecting was to experience sexism from my peer group, where the boys were actually, I did a gender studies course which was full of boys, and lots of the boys were trying to prove how right on they were. And I wouldn't want to universalise from my experience, because other women will have had different experiences at university, but my experience was that my contemporaries, my male contemporaries, were more interested in proving how right on they were than putting me down or being laddish or groping. I certainly didn't go out at night and expect to be groped. And when you look at the NUS that have done a lot of work recently at ladism culture, for example, at university, and young women's experience, then reading the statistics of young women at university now, then a significant proportion of women do seem to be feeling intimidated, that university is a very laddish place, alienated, that they go out and expect to be groped, and that was not my experience by any means.
And so when you made the film, you and Kirsty, did you then go, well, we've got to do, what do you think should be the call to arms? I mean, what is being asked then in terms of society looking at itself?
I mean, Hannah might have something to say about this as a writer as well, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed is, when I was at The Guardian and pre-internet, actually we were getting this stuff. I was getting this stuff. So I was getting hate mail. I was getting postcards with pictures of monkeys on them. But it was by the post. It wasn't coming directly to my phone. The person who was sending this kind of stuff was having to go out there, pay for a stamp, and there was a little bit of effort that had to go into it. Now, I think the reason we're seeing so much more of it, and the reason I think other people are seeing it who perhaps didn't see it before, is because of the internet, because of social media.
It's the anonymity. You can troll people virtually anonymously. I think that is a real problem, and I think, in a way, civil society has grown up over kind of 2,000 years. But then, 20 years ago, we didn't have the internet. And I feel that there's no way that we don't have a kind of behavioral norm for the internet. There's nothing that, I have this kind of naive view that you should be able to turn on your computer, and the first thing you don't see is Google or Apple or whatever. The first thing you see is a little note, which is you're entering the World Wide Web. Please treat people you meet here with courtesy and respect. And if they see it more often enough, a few people will think that it's actually not acceptable to behave as they do.
But Hannah, is it a sense that the web or the internet is actually creating this behaviour, or it's reflecting a new phase of attitude about women? Which is it?
I don't think it's creating behaviour. I think it's simply reflecting behaviour that exists already. I think it's amplifying it, exactly. Actually, I had a slightly different experience at university, and in the beginning of my career, I was expecting to be groped. I was expecting street harassment. I was expecting racist abuse when I was writing for The Guardian, and I was getting it. The difference was, I said, it wasn't appearing beneath an article I'd written. It was just coming into the post room. And so I think my experience is actually, I feel very strongly now that what we're seeing is a reflection. We're seeing it coming to people who perhaps weren't getting it before. So there are more of us getting this, which means we're angrier about it. It's being discussed in forums like this, which is fantastic. And I think it's not, that doesn't mean to say that I think the internet is all bad. It doesn't mean anything, I don't think we should all come off it. I don't think we should all abandon it. There are some incredible voices that are amplified at the same time.
But this is not just about the internet, is it? Because your film was also about videos, pop videos, it was about gaming, as we've seen, and it was also about stand-up comics. It was about a whole attitude of being able to use rape, assault, violence, terrible words, terrible phrases. Ian, you are one of our major broadcasters, and you hold a fantastic public space. Do you think this shift in terms of dislike, hatred, and permission to dislike is something that you've witnessed and you can see from where you stand?
I think the key issue is, and I think Hannah sort of put her finger on it really, is it's about the ease with which people have been able to unleash these incredibly unpleasant attacks, messages, and the lack of consequences. And it's not just, sometimes it is anonymity. So oddly enough, I got trolled this week extremely unpleasantly, both me and my wife, successively. And when I tried to work out who it was obviously an account that had just been set up for that purpose. And by the next day, because I was watching it, looking for the moment when you could perhaps work out who it was, the account had gone. So you can have anonymity if you want to be abusive. But the thing that really strikes me is that lots of people are prepared to be unbelievably unpleasant not anonymously. And the reason is because by and large there aren't consequences. Because if you're incredibly abusive to anyone, a man or a woman, outside on the embankment, there'll be consequences. And if you do it on Twitter, by and large there aren't. And I think that's emboldened the worst of people in all sorts of areas, but particularly sexism and misogyny. And we definitely see, if I watch the Twitter stream for Newsnight on a given evening, it's profoundly unpleasant, often towards me, sometimes largely towards me. But the nature of the unpleasantness towards women presenters, Kirsty when she's presenting, Laura, Emily, is subtly different to the unpleasantness that might be directed at a male presenter. It is, we were talking about this a little earlier, Gabby and I mean, it is more violent, more sexual, it is more about appearance.
And are men, I mean, if this is true, like you as a man observe it, you know, because when women say that, sometimes men go, oh, that's just in your imagination or you're paranoid or whatever. When men say, no, we see it, we witness it, I suppose the next step I'm interested in, from your point of view, Ian, is, so what can men do to say this behaviour is absolutely unacceptable, it will not be tolerated, because it isn't something, women have been saying it for a long time. So now that you notice it, what can you do about it? What can other men do about it?
Well, you've got to call it out when you see it. I mean, I'm well, as you say that, I'm remembering a particular occasion when one of my women colleagues was presenting the show, and a male journalist who we all knew was tweeting about her cleavage on Twitter. And I think what we did in that case was just to retweet it, because actually often that is the most...
Not sack him?
No, he wasn't someone who worked for us.
Okay.
He was one of the people who will tweet about the show sometimes. But sometimes the most effective thing, Stella Creasy does this absolutely brilliantly, is she just retweets the most unpleasant tweets at her. And I think, but it's about creating consequences. Yeah. So if you look at, say, I mean, we were criticised very heavily Newsnight for interviewing Dapper Laughs. You remember he had this ghastly show about how to pull women, and then he did some live shows in which he made rape jokes. But I feel incredibly strongly that what we were doing was creating consequences for unacceptable behaviour. Right, and only by bringing him into a sort of mainstream environment and confronting him with the arguments against what he was doing, was he forced to and in the end he retired his character. Live, I've heard he's since brought it back, but I think that's what you can do. You can call it out when you see it.
I think calling out is incredibly important. I think calling out is really, really important. I wish somebody, an executive from Twitter was here, because Twitter is very, very slow on the uptake sometimes. It takes a long time for Twitter to come around to thinking that things are unacceptable. And the more that we call out Twitter, and the more that a retweeting or whatever to get something stopped, which is what Stella Creasy did, it is really, really important.
Ian, do you also think it's about the way women are represented in public life generally? I mean, just in terms of women on platforms, women being the norm of everyday discussions, because, I went to an event the other night, it was 18 people, 3 of them were women, all the rest were men, because it was about economics and finance. And which is why I was there. But the thing is that it was like, I felt like I was still being in a paradigm where, in a way, they thought, better have some women for decorative extra. So, and I feel that sometimes on broadcasting, in fact, many times. But I know that you feel that too. What will you do about it?
We just feel it is a kind of perennial battle, and it's a battle that I feel we lose more often than we win it. To try and get women at least equally represented on the show is what we want, but at least significantly represented on the show.
But you're the editor, so why do you lose the battle?
Well, let me try and tell you, and I want to ask Hannah about this, because I was asking her this question before we came on. She said she would only answer it on the stage. So I'm bracing myself for that.
This is live broadcasting.
By the way, I should say we bid for Hannah regularly, and she never comes on. But before Hannah tells us why, I mean, let me try and give you a sense of how it looks from where we are. We start every day with the aspiration of making the show as equal as we can, right? Or as generally diverse as we can, but particularly as gender balanced as we can. We then start off at a disadvantage, because the kind of subjects that we cover on Newsnight, the brute fact is women are underrepresented in those subjects. It's the economics and diplomacy and the issue that you were talking about. But we try double hard to find great women voices, and there are great women voices in all those areas, and you can find them. We then find, surprise, surprise, that women are slightly less inclined to come and sound off on a subject that they don't absolutely know about. It's really interesting that, funny enough, men are very happy to bullshit miles off their territory, women not so much. You then find that, surprise, surprise, women are slightly less willing to give up 2-3 hours in the evening when they might be with their family than men are. So you've got a whole lot of things, I think, stacked up against you. Then there's the subject, which I think I'm going to let Hannah talk about, really, which is whether shows like ours are somehow, or women feel that shows like ours are somehow stacked against women.
Let's turn to Hannah at this point, because this is a kind of about women being respected in the public space, isn't it?
It is, and I've been trying to figure out how to answer this without using bad language, so I'm going to try. But, you're right, and, the show does approach me, and every time I take it very seriously, and I think about it, and the conclusion I generally come to is it's against my deepest and most basic survival instincts. I have a very strong survival instinct. I am a campaigner, I am a journalist, and yet when an approach comes from, and it's not just Newsnight, it is other shows as well, but from certain shows, I know that the space, the tone and the language is already actively stacked against me. I also know that even if I perform well, whatever that means, I'm going to spend the next evening, the next week, dealing with a whole lot of racism, sexism and misogyny coming directly at me. And I don't feel that the programme does anything to change that tone.
Okay, I should be clear, we're not here to interrogate the Newsnight per se.
Yeah.
But what you're really saying is the combative journalism.
Well, I was just going to say the second point is it's not just when you're asked, but it's also why you're asked. And so I'm asked for certain subjects, and I don't have a problem with that because I like to talk about certain subjects in as many platforms as possible. However, I don't choose to self-harm. That's probably I'm going to spend a lot of time dealing with a lot of aggro, and so I weigh up, is it worth my while? And I also know, because
you're self-censoring
I am
dreadfully there,
absolutely,
Hannah.
I completely am. However, I think that a lot of women have self-censored by not going on. Yeah. And I think, as a result, programmes like Newsnight are now thinking, oh my God, we're in crisis. We're not doing well. We're not having enough women. So there's a point at which self-censorship and self-silencing, I completely agree, sometimes tips over into forcing people to change their modes and to change their structures.
Kirsty, anything there?
What I would say about that is that I hope that Newsnight it's not, however it might in the past had a reputation for being some kind of bear pit, that is not what we're about. And I think the general discourse is a positive one. And so therefore I would really encourage more women to come forward. And the other thing, Hannah, is having to deal with racism and sexism afterwards on your own. The next time you come on, I promise that we will go after the people that attack you after the programme. That is our job.
Okay, now, I think we should be...
Yes, let's away from Newsnight.
Let's get away from Newsnight. But what we're really saying is that this is a kind of a string of pearls, isn't it?
Yes.
That if you have a smashed window in one place, then somebody will smash the window next to it. And if you have a disrespectful public space that's very high profile, like the House of Commons, then it has a massive impact in terms of the permission that you have in other spaces to be as rude and horrible as you like. And the point about no consequences. So, first of all, I'm going to ask Lily, what do you think, like in the playground in the school, I am told that if you make a homophobic remark or a racist remark, you're straight to the head teacher. But if you make a sexist remark, it's, oh, come on, guys, just calm down, will you? Am I right?
Well, I think, firstly, it's quite unhelpful to compare different types of oppression in society, because every different type has a different history, it has different social meanings, and I think although a lot of schools do have this kind of policy, not just sexist language but homophobic language and racist language, a lot of the time, because it happens so often, teachers or people in charge don't always address it every time, because then they'd be sending someone to the classroom, to the head teacher practically every lesson, so it doesn't always get addressed just because it's so common.
Right.
But of course that's not true for every teacher, every classroom or every school. And
I wonder what you did, Lily, was also you came up with a kind of a kind of rubric, something that you could actually talk about, that actually it was kind of not like, thou will not be sexist, but it was something like that, wasn't it? You actually came up with a form of words that had to be, you wanted actually to be circulated around schools in England.
Yes, so me and my friends Yaz and George have started Campaign for Consent, which is campaigning to get consent taught as part of the national curriculum compulsorily. So at the moment, sexual consent just isn't taught as part of the curriculum, and that means not every child in England and Wales actually gets taught that your consent to sexual acts is necessary, which I think is awful. I think it's the most basic part of sex education.
So Lily, can I just ask you, is that campaign that you're starting, which is an obligation to teach about sexual consent in schools, is that a campaign that people here can actively join and support you on?
Oh, absolutely.
How?
Not just ours. Our campaign's Campaign for Consent. That's still going on. We're collecting experiences of pupils, of teachers, of parents, of either being taught consent in schools and what it's meant for them, or not being taught consent in schools, and the consequences for them and how they feel it's affected them. Also, a huge range. Almost every single sexual health or young people's charity or organisation is working towards SRE now, Sex and Relation Education. Now, the Sex Education Forum, Pass It On by Laura Bates from Everyday Sexism. There is, just Google it and you'll find a myriad of amazing organisations and campaigns.
So there's a call out. Please support the campaigns to get sexual awareness of rights into schools. Gabby, can I come back to you? You've made this one film with Kirsty. What has it galvanised you to now do as a filmmaker, as an artist? What do you want to do next now that you've discovered this work that shocked you?
I mean, I'd like to, it would be nice to make, I mean, I think what we did in that film was that we looked at sort of verbal and online abuse. I mean, what I'd quite like to do would be to look at the sort of the next stage, which would be domestic violence, and the fact that rape is so woefully under-prosecuted in the UK. But even within the BBC, which is in many ways a very supportive organisation, it's actually quite hard to get women's issues to be seen as mainstream. And even though we make up 51% of the population, we still are seen as a slightly minority interest.
Yes, and I think this is the kind of central key, isn't it, Hannah, which is that, it's like, well, now for some women's issues, even though that is the way that the whole of humanity lives, is with, by, and for women, actually all of the things that are relevant to women become something to be discussed by women a bit.
Yeah, and that goes to the contribution earlier on about why we're asked to speak about certain things. And I think the idea that whether it's childcare, whether it's education, those things that are considered soft issues are considered women's issues, and then politics and economics are considered male and tough, strong issues. Obviously, they're all just, everybody's issues. And I think it's the same with race, and I think it's the same with disability, actually. I think all of those conversations need to be much more diversified and strengthened.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, if as a show of hands, people in here who have suffered incidents of sexism. Can we have a show of hands? Keep your hands up if you feel you're capable of dealing with it and fighting back. Oh, that's quite interesting. Maybe it's this conference that's helping.
Well, I think we're here to support each other as well. Go on.
Sexism affects men as well. That's
Yes.
the thing.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
the key point.
Yes, I mean, and that's a kind of absolutely key thing, which is that boys and men are being groomed to accept behaviour, even feel that they need to imitate behaviour, which they don't necessarily want to, and they're not necessarily sure whether that is what's appropriate, but they feel they need to do it.
I think help for young men is incredibly important. We filmed a sex education classroom, and really what was horrifying was that some of the young men in the class admitted that the ideas that they got for sexual relations came from porn online, and it cannot be underestimated how corrosive that is. The other thing that I found quite extraordinary in that classroom was that there were boys and girls whose parents didn't talk to them about sex education or indeed sex, and I think, as a starting point, that is a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to just end with you, Lily, because you've heard something which might be a bit dismaying, which is that Kirsty and myself and Gabby all saying, well, it wasn't so bad when we were younger. That we thought equality was coming our way. It was coming our way in lots of ways, but we weren't dealing with this level of, I say, misogyny. So that is kind of a dismaying fact. How do you feel in terms of consequences that the society needs to address this?
Well, I think, firstly, we do need to acknowledge that sexism is a problem. A huge amount of people, politicians, people in charge, head teachers, parents, don't acknowledge that sexism and patriarchy is a problem. So I'd say the first step is acknowledge the problem before we start to treat it.
Okay, and then Ian, I'm going to ask you to say one more thing, really, which was that from all the years we've been doing WOW now, the media in all forms is viewed by many women as amoral at best and immoral many times, because it doesn't choose to side with human rights with regard to women. It just doesn't choose to side with them. And I'm wondering whether you could see a campaign being launched by the leaders in media, like yourself, that says, no, we are going to side for women with regard to human rights in total.
Well, I mean, generalising about the media is a bit like generalising about men or women, frankly. I mean, I think if you look at the BBC's record, I'll take issue, I think, a bit with Gabby's characterisation. I was just thinking as she was talking about the last few weeks and months of BBC output. I mean, BBC4 screened on Wednesday night this extraordinary Storyville about the Delhi bus rape. We screened it, a version of it the night before. One of the single most powerful pieces of work I've seen about attitudes to women and rape anywhere ever. I, on the weekend, was listening to Radio 5 Investigates, one of the most devastating bits of radio documentary I've heard about mentally ill women being put into forced marriages in the UK. I was thinking about, or you had Katie Razzle in here to receive an award this week about for the work she's been doing on young women who are not unable to be funded because of their immigrant status. So I just think there's a very mixed record. On the other hand, on the way in here today, I did pick up a newspaper, and on page 3 was a picture of Elle Macpherson at 50 and how great she looked, and a couple of pages back was a piece about how the most appealing angle of a woman's bum was 45 degrees with a picture of Jennifer Lopez. And in between, there was a piece about a young girl who committed suicide after feeling bullied and after having great anxieties about her body image. And she'd held up pictures on Ask FM saying, you're only popular if you're a slag and you've got big boobs and so on. And I thought there's about as much as you need to know in that sequence of pages. So it's an incredibly mixed picture. Could the media play a more proactive role? Yes, I think they could. If you look at what places like The Guardian have done on issues like FGM, I think it's been incredibly powerful. Newsnight's got a very, I think, good record on picking up issues like FGM. Could we do more? I think we could.
Okay, that's very positive.